My name is FA Callaway. I'm 34 and I redline buildings for a living. I check what holds and what doesn't before anyone signs. At my sister's wedding, the groom's mother stood up in the middle of the ceremony, pointed at Lily and called her trash. Then she threw a prenuptial agreement in my sister's face. My parents sat there and said nothing. I didn't. I walked up the aisle, took the pages out of Lily's hands and tore them in half. Then I walked her out the door. Tearing that paper felt like the end of something. It wasn't. 3 weeks later, I set a single folder on a cold marble table, and that groom and his mother went pale and started to scream. This is how a quiet woman with a red pen took a family apart. Welcome back to Wow Drama Stories, where ordinary women keep their voices level and let the truth do the shouting. If you've ever stayed calm while someone louder tried to bury you, you already understand, my sister. Stay with me to the end, drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. I should explain who I am because it matters for everything that comes next. I read the whole thing before I sign, always. It's a habit from work where a missed line in a spec can drop a stairwell. But the truth is, I've been like that since I was a kid. Our mother died when I was 22 and Lily was 15. Our father went quiet in a way that never fully lifted, and somebody had to keep the lights on. So I worked nights through my last year of school, then took the first engineering job that would have me, and I half-raised my sister from a folding chair at the kitchen table. I checked her homework. I read her lease. I told her which credit card to cut up. People think over-responsibility is a soft flaw. It isn't. It's the thing that makes you exhausting at parties and useful at funerals. I knew this about myself. What I was still learning at 34 was that you can love someone so hard you forget to let them carry their own weight, and that the forgetting can leave them unpracticed when the real weight finally lands. Lily made pottery and taught art 2 mornings a week. She had this way of making strangers feel chosen. I envied it. I also worried about it because the people who can make you feel chosen can also be chosen by the wrong kind of person. I told myself I was being dramatic. I'm never dramatic. That should have been my first warning. The night she called to say she'd met someone named Marin Pembroke, I heard something new in her voice. Brightness, and underneath it a thread of careful I didn't recognize yet. The Pembrokes were old money in a town that didn't have much of it. 3 generations, a foundation with their name on a hospital wing, a house with a circular drive and a fountain that ran even in February. The first time I visited, I put my hand on the entryway wall and felt cold white marble polished so smooth it didn't hold heat at all. I remember thinking a house shouldn't feel like a bank lobby. Lily glowed in that house at first. New coat, new posture, a laugh that arrived a half-second late, like she was checking it against something before letting it out. Grayson was handsome in the way that photographs well and ages into something else. He pulled out chairs. He remembered the name of my firm. He was by every visible measure perfect. And perfect always makes me reach for my pen. I watched my sister around him and I noticed the small things first. She set her phone face down now. When it lit up, she flipped it before reading and a muscle moved in her jaw. Once mid-sentence, she glanced at him to check whether the sentence was allowed. I'd never seen Lily check a sentence in her life. I asked her gently on the drive back to my apartment near Des Moines whether everything was okay. She said she'd never been happier, and she meant it. And that was the part that scared me. Happy people don't flinch at a screen. I didn't have a name for what I was seeing. I just knew the readings didn't add up. And when readings don't add up, you don't sign. You go find the line you missed. Marin Pembroke ran the family the way I run a job site, except her structures were people. She was 60, elegant, and fluent in the kind of insult that comes wrapped in a compliment. At the engagement dinner, she sat me beside her, which I understood was a test, not a kindness. She asked what I did. I told her. She smiled and said, "It must be so satisfying to work with your hands the way you'd say it to a gardener." Then she turned to Lily. "And you make little bowls," she said. "How charming. People do love a hobby." She let the word hobby sit there until it curdled. I watched my sister shrink an inch in her chair, and I watched our parents laugh along, eager to be liked. Marin talked about the family the whole evening. The foundation, the gala, the name. Old money, she kept saying, as if money could get old enough to become a virtue. She looked at Lily across the candles, and I saw it clearly for 1 second. She wasn't looking at a daughter-in-law. She was looking at a liability she hadn't yet decided how to write off. I kept my voice level and asked her one question. I asked how Grayson and Lily had met. Marin's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. A small recalculation. The look of a person remembering there are things they'd rather not have asked about out loud. At a fundraiser, she said, "He's always been so generous with his time." I made a note in the back of my head. The way I note a crack that's hairline today and structural by spring. generous with his time. I'd come back to that line. It would come back to me, too. The red flags didn't wave. They whispered. Lily's college roommate, a woman I'd known for years, called me one evening and started a sentence 3 times before she finished it. "I just want Lily to be careful," she said. There were stories about Grayson before. I asked what stories. She got quiet. "I shouldn't have called," she said. And then she didn't call again, and her number went dark when I tried back. People don't go silent like that over gossip. They go silent like that when silence has a price. So, I did what I do. I looked. I'm not naive. I didn't trust a perfect man with my sister and hope for the best. I searched Marin Pembroke every way I knew how, and what I found was the strange thing. Nothing. Not a parking ticket, not a tagged photo, not a single rough edge. A man that polished isn't lucky. He's expensive. Someone had paid to sand him down, and you don't pay to hide a clean record. When I pressed Lily about her roommate's call, she defended him so fast. The words tripped over each other. She's jealous. Lily said she doesn't know him. Then she told me a name just once, a woman's name, and said it was nothing. An ex who'd caused problems. And she changed the subject so hard the table almost moved. I let it go. Not because I believed her, because I'd learned that pushing my sister toward a wall only made her press her back against it. I wrote the name down on the inside cover of my work notebook next to the load tables where I keep things. I didn't know yet that I'd need it. The thing about my parents' silence is that it had a receipt. I found out by accident. The way you find most rot by reaching for something else. Dad's hardware store had been dying for 2 years. I knew that. Who'd kept it breathing? I'd never thought to ask. Over coffee, Mom let it slip that the store had been helped along by a bridge loan, and when I asked who from, she suddenly needed to refill a cup that was full. I pushed once. She said the name like it cost her. The Pembrokes. Marin had quietly floated my father $40,000 to keep the lights on, framed as a kindness between Soontobe family with terms nobody had read out loud. My father, who taught me to read the whole thing before I sign, had signed something he didn't read because he was drowning, and someone handed him a rope with a hook in it. I understood then why my parents laughed at Marin's jokes. I understood why "don't make waves" had become my mother's favorite sentence. When someone holds your survival, they don't have to threaten you. The debt does the talking. "Faye, please," Mom said, reading my face. "Don't make this hard for everyone. It's almost over. They'll be family." I looked at her across the table and felt something settle in my chest, cold and clear, like the moment a calculation finally balances. My parents weren't silent because they were cruel. They were silent because they were bought. And the cheapest thing to buy is a frightened person who loves their kid. That was fixable. I just didn't know yet how much I'd have to spend. The prenuptial agreement arrived 11 days before the wedding. It came by courier from a lawyer named Whitlock, who'd been the Pembroke family's fixer long enough to have a parking space at their estate. He called it a formality. He used that word 4 times in one phone call, the way men use a word when they need it to do more work than it can. Lily was told to sign it and not bother her pretty head. No lawyer of her own, no list of what Grayson actually owned, no time, just a deadline shaped like an altar. I sat at my kitchen table that night with the document and my red pen, and I felt my whole spine straighten because this I knew how to read. A contract is just a building made of sentences. You can see where it's designed to fail and who it's designed to fail on. The terms were ugly. In a divorce, Lily walked away with nothing, waived support entirely, and signed a confidentiality clause so broad it would have covered the weather. But it was the timing that gave it away. You don't hand someone a life-altering waiver at the church door unless the church door is the point. The deadline was the weapon. The rush was the duress. I'd seen contractors pull the same move. Bury a bad clause in a stack instead of signing for 5 on a Friday, hoping you're too tired to read. I read the whole thing before I sign, and Lily was my sister, so I read it for her. Then I got to the recital. That boring block of "whereas nobody reads" in one line stopped my pen cold. It referenced a prior confidential settlement by name and number. A settlement reference in a prenup is like a patch over a hole in a wall. It tells you exactly where the damage is. I went back through the document slowly, line by line, dragging my red felt tip under every clause until the margins bled. The confidentiality language wasn't standard boilerplate. It was tailored. It reached backward as well as forward, binding Lily to silence about matters previously resolved by the Pembroke family, which is a strange thing to ask of a woman before she's married into anything. You don't write a muzzle that detailed for a marriage. You write it for a cover-up that needs a new room to hide in. The recital named a settlement and a case style, the kind of dry reference lawyers leave because the law makes them, never imagining anyone would care. I circled it in red. A matter resolved, sealed. I sat with it for a long time. Then I drove out to Lily's the next morning, the house she'd moved into with Grayson 4 months back. All that cold marble. And I tried to talk to her without sounding like an alarm. I asked if she knew what the settlement clause referred to. She went still. She said it was old, that Grayson had explained it, that some woman had tried to ruin him years ago and his family had handled it. Handled it. I asked who the woman was. Lily's eyes flicked to the hallway to the room where he might be, and she said very quietly that she didn't want to talk about it in the house. I didn't push. I'd learned that. But I drove back to Des Moines with a case reference burning a hole in my notebook sitting right beside that name I'd written months before. Here's something most people don't think about. The records of a lawsuit are public. Not always the contents. Those can be sealed, locked behind a judge's order. But the fact of the case, the names, the dates, the docket, that part lives in daylight. In a county index, anybody can search, and I search indexes for a living. When you pull permits and easements and zoning history all day, the courthouse stops being a scary place and starts being a filing cabinet. So I started looking. I searched the Pembroke name in the civil index, and the problem was the opposite of what I'd feared. Not too little, but too much. Old money leaves a trail of disputes. Contractors, neighbors, a contested estate. The name alone returned years of noise. I needed a date to cut through it, and a date was the one thing I didn't have. The settlement reference gave me a number, but not a year I could trust, and the name in my notebook gave me a person, but no proof she'd ever filed anything at all. I sat in the courthouse annex with a paper coffee going cold and felt the wall of it. This is the part nobody tells you about doing the right thing. It isn't a lightning bolt. It's a search bar, and 1,000 wrong returns and the slow patience of someone who reads the whole thing. I needed one fixed point, one date to anchor everything else. And then, 2 days later, my sister's wedding handed me one in the worst way a date can be given. The wedding was at the Pembroke estate, of course, under a white tent on a lawn that cost more to maintain than my apartment. Lily looked beautiful and brittle, like good china that's been dropped once and glued. I sat in the second row next to our parents who wore their best clothes and their carefully blank faces. The ceremony started fine. Then, right before the vows, Marin Pembroke rose from her seat in the front row, and I knew from the way she stood, slow, deliberate, performing, that this was planned. She had a sheath of papers in her hand. She walked into the aisle, turned to the guests, and said in a voice pitched to Carrie that she would not watch her son marry without protecting what 3 generations had built. Then she looked at my sister and said, "It trash doesn't marry a Pembroke." She threw the pages. They hit Lily's chest and scattered at her feet. The prenup unsigned, a contract used as a slap. The tent went silent. 150 people held their breath. I looked at my father, I looked at my mother. They stared at their laps, and my mother whispered the only thing she had left. We just didn't want a scene. That was the moment something in me went quiet and certain. I stood up. I walked up that aisle in my flat shoes, past the flowers, past the held breath, and I bent and gathered the pages off the grass. I straightened them like I was about to sign them. Then I tore them in half, and the sound of it cut through the tent like a struck match. I took my sister's hand. "Come on," I said. "We're done here." We walked out together across that cold marble entryway and into the sun, and behind us the whole beautiful machine sat frozen. Walking her out wasn't revenge. People thought it was the end. But Marin had stood up and announced the date in front of witnesses the exact day she'd tried to bury my sister in silence. She just handed me my fixed point. That night, Lily came apart in my apartment, which is small and warm, and smells like the eucalyptus I keep on the radiator, the opposite of marble in every way that matters. She cried the kind of cry that's been saved up for months. And then finally, out of that house and away from him, she told me the truth she'd been hiding. It wasn't one big thing, it was 100 small ones, which is how the worst things hide. He chose her clothes and called it taste. He counted her drinks and called it caring. He went through her phone and called it trust. There had been one night early on that frightened her enough to keep. A night she wouldn't describe in detail but couldn't stop circling where she'd understood for the first time that the locks in that house faced inward. And the name I'd written in my notebook months ago. Lily said it out loud at last and told me what little Grayson had let slip in an unguarded moment. Drunk and proud. A woman who'd made accusations. A family who'd made it disappear. I held my sister and I kept my voice level because she didn't need my anger. She had enough of her own to drown in. "I believe you," I said, "all of it." Then I asked her one question, the only one that mattered for what I was going to do. I asked when had the woman made her accusations, Lily thought. She gave me a season and a year, a window narrow enough to matter. I wrote it down under the case reference and the name. 3 lines now, a column of facts that finally pointed the same direction. My sister fell asleep on my couch around 2. I sat up till dawn with my notebook and my cold coffee, and for the first time in weeks the wall had a door in it. With a season and a year, the courthouse index stopped being noise and started being a map. I went back to the annex on Monday, sat at the public terminal, and narrowed the search to that window. The Pembroke returns shrank from years to months, then to a handful, then to one that made my stomach drop. A civil case, a plaintiff filing as Jane Doe, which courts allow when someone is protecting themselves. Defendant Marin Pembroke filed, then resolved within the year, the docket marked settled, and the file sealed by stipulation. Sealed. That word is supposed to feel like a locked door. But here's what the Pembrokes either forgot or assumed I'd never understand. Sealing a file hides what's inside the case. It does not erase that the case existed. The docket stays, the caption stays. The fact of a woman walking into a courthouse and accusing Marin Pembroke under oath on a date Marin had just announced at a wedding. That stays in daylight where I was sitting. The settlement reference in the prenup matched the case number on the screen. The same matter, the same muzzle now being fitted onto my sister's mouth before she'd said a single vow. I printed the docket sheet. The annex printer was slow and loud, and I watched the page crawl out an inch at a time. The dry, ugly, beautiful list of filings. A complaint. A protective order granted. A stipulated dismissal. A seal. None of it was a conviction. And I made myself say that out loud in the empty car. A protective order isn't a verdict. A sealed settlement isn't a confession. Snorts, people settle for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with guilt. But it was a sworn complaint, and a judge who had seen enough to sign an order, and that I could not file under coincidence. It was a documented reason to stop trusting the Polish and start asking the questions nobody in my family wanted asked. I took the page back to my car and sat with it in the parking lot, my hands steady, my pulse not. I uncapped my red pen. I circled the case number in red, one clean loop around a string of digits on a public docket sheet in a courthouse parking lot while the engine ticked as it cooled. That circle is the thing I want you to hold on to because I held on to it for everything that came after. People imagine justice as a courtroom thunderclap. Mostly it's a circled number on a printout and a woman deciding not to look away. I understood sitting there exactly what the Pembrokes had bought and what they hadn't. Money can seal a file, it can't unfill. They'd spent a fortune to make the contents of that case vanish, and it had worked. The contents were gone, locked tight. But the spine of the thing stood there in the open. A protective order had been granted, which a judge does not do for nothing, which a judge does for cause. A complaint had been filed and never withdrawn, only settled. The Pembroke method came into focus like a structure under a developing photograph. They didn't make problems untrue. They made them quiet. The prenup wasn't a marriage document at all. It was a confidentiality agreement wearing a wedding dress. The next clause in a long policy of buying silence, and Lily had been about to sign her own. I looked at the protective order line until the letters stopped being letters. Somewhere out there was the woman who'd filed it. Jane Doe, who'd been brave once in a building like the one I was parked outside and then been paid to disappear. I kept the pen. I had a docket, a date, and a fact a judge had already found credible enough to act on. What I didn't have yet was the one thing the law leaves up to a person and not a record. Her name and whether she'd ever be willing to use it again. Finding a woman who spent years disappearing is not a thing you do in an afternoon. And it's not a thing you do by trickery. I want to be clear about that because the difference is everything. I didn't tail anyone. I didn't bluff my way into private files. I worked the public record and one honest contact. A paralegal named Ruth Avery I'd met years back when a property line went to court, who now did family law and didn't flinch at hard cases. Through filings and a few careful, legitimate steps, I learned the woman's name, Dana Cole. She lived 2 states away now, under a different last name, with a life she'd rebuilt brick by brick. And I understood the moment I found her that I was holding something fragile. The settlement she'd signed bound her to silence. Reaching her at all could feel like a threat, like the past kicking her door. So I didn't ambush her. I wrote a short letter. I told her who I was and who my sister was and what had happened at a wedding. I told her I'd found nothing private, only the docket anyone could find, and that I wasn't asking her for anything. I left my number in one sentence. You don't owe us your story, but if you ever want to know you're not the only one, I'm here. Then I mailed it and did the hardest thing in my whole life, which is nothing. I waited. I didn't call again. I didn't push. Pushing is what they'd done to her. I wasn't going to win my sister's freedom by borrowing the enemy's tools. So, I went home and I waited. And somewhere 2 states away, a woman read a letter and sat with it. The way I'd sat with that circled number. Marin didn't wait. While I was being patient, she went to work because patience was never her instrument. Shame was. Within a week, the story was everywhere our family lived. Lily was a gold digger who'd schemed her way toward the Pembroke fortune and been caught. Lily was unstable. Lily had humiliated a fine family at their own son's wedding. Marin had a foundation and a guest list and 40 years of favors, and she spent them like a woman who'd budgeted for exactly this. The version of events that spread had my sister as the villain and a throne contract as self-defense. And then she reached for the lover she trusted most. She called my parents. She reminded them sweetly about the loan, about how loans can be called, about how unfortunate it would be if the hardware store's good fortune ran out right when the family needed to close ranks. My mother called me crying. She says if we don't get Lily to apologize to make it right, they'll want the money back, all of it. Now, I listened to my mother's fear and I recognized Marin's whole strategy in one move. She thought shame was a weapon only she could hold. She thought silence was a thing you could buy on credit forever and never have the note called on you. She'd built her family's safety on the certainty that the people she hurt would always have a reason to stay quiet. A debt, a deadline, a daughter to protect. Mom, I said, don't promise her anything, don't apologize for anything, give me 2 weeks. I heard her hesitate on the line. The sound of a frightened person trying to decide whether to be brave. I didn't blame her. I just had 2 weeks to make brave affordable. Ruth Avery agreed to meet me in her office, a small one with good light and bad chairs, and she did the thing I'd needed someone with a license to do. She told me what the paper was worth. I slid the prenup across her desk, and she read it the way I read it, slow with a pen, frowning at the recital. When she finished, she sat it down and said something I'll keep the rest of my life. This isn't a strong contract, it's a wish. Then she walked me through the why carefully, the way honest professionals qualify things. In Iowa, like most states that follow the Uniform Premarital Agreement Act, an agreement isn't automatically void, but it becomes very hard to enforce when the facts look like these. Signed under pressure, hours before a wedding. No independent lawyer for the person waiving everything. No financial disclosure. No list of what the wealthy party even owned. A waiver of support with no counsel behind it. Handed to a bride at the altar, Ruth said, with the wedding as the threat. That's the kind of fact pattern that gives you strong grounds to challenge it. Duress, no independent counsel, no disclosure. I can't promise you a judge throws it out. That depends on the state, the judge, the whole picture of how it was signed. But a contract like this has serious enforceability problems, and they'd have a steep hill to climb to make it stick. They know it. I asked her why a family with this much money would write a contract this week. She looked at me a moment. Because they've never had to enforce one, she said. The threat was always enough. Nobody ever read the whole thing and called the bluff. I almost laughed. The paper they'd weaponized was the weakest thing in the room. They'd spent their lives counting on the fact that frightened people don't push back. They'd never met a frightened person with a red pen and a habit of reading every word. Grayson came to find me himself, which told me how scared they were getting. He showed up at my firm's parking lot at the end of a workday, leaning on a car worth more than my salary, all charm and warm voice. And for about 30 seconds, he tried the version of himself that had fooled my sister. He said he loved Lily. He said this was all a misunderstanding his mother had blown up. He said we were still family, and family protects each other. I let him talk. Then I watched the charm slip, because charm is a coat, and the weather always changes. When I didn't melt, his voice dropped, and the warmth went out of it like a thermostat clicking off. You're a smart woman, Faye, he said. Smart women know what's worth digging into and what isn't. Some things, when you dig them up, they fall on you. He smiled when he said it. He thought that was subtle, I've stood under cranes carrying 12 tons of steel I don't scare on a parking lot. I told him I appreciated the advice. I told him that careful is the whole job, that engineers are careful by trade, and that the careful thing when something's been buried is to find out whether it was buried because it was dangerous or because it was true. His jaw worked. He got in his expensive car and left a little too fast. I stood there a moment in the cooling evening and understood I'd just been threatened by a man who'd had years of practice making threats land softly. The difference this time was that I'd already seen the protective order. I knew which of us the court had once believed. It wasn't him. Dana Cole called me on a Thursday night, 11 days after I mailed the letter. I almost didn't recognize the number. Her voice was steady and quiet, a voice that had practiced being calm under pressure the same way mine had. She'd snorts, read about the wedding, word travels, even 2 states away when a family like the Pembrokes makes noise. She told me she'd thrown my letter away the first day and fished it back out of the trash the second. I decided a long time ago to never think about him again, she said. And then I read that he was about to do it to someone else. We talked for 2 hours. I told her almost nothing about her own case because I didn't know it. It was sealed and I'd never tried to learn what was inside. I only knew the docket, the public bones of it. She appreciated that more than I expected. Everyone who's ever contacted me wanted the story, she said. You're the first one who already knew the part that mattered and didn't ask for the rest. I told her the truth. She didn't owe us anything. Her settlement had bought her peace and she had every right to keep it. She was quiet for a while. Then she said the thing that changed the shape of everything. The agreement I signed says I can't talk about what happened to me. She said it doesn't say I can't stand next to your sister while she talks about hers. She'd already run those exact words past her own attorney. She told me read the language aloud over the phone, asked the careful question, and been told that affirming a case was real without breathing a word of the sealed facts lived on the right side of the line. She wasn't guessing. She'd lawyered her one sentence the way I'd have lawyered mine. I sat down slowly on my kitchen floor. She hadn't owed us a single word. She'd decided we were worth the risk anyway. That's not a document. That's a person. You can't buy that. And the Pembrokes had built everything on the belief that you could. I want to be fair to Marin because the truth is stronger when it's fair. In those 2 weeks I learned where she came from, and it complicated my anger without forgiving it. Marin hadn't been born a Pembroke. She'd married in 40 years ago, a girl from nowhere who'd been handed a brutal prenup at her own engagement, and made to understand clearly that she would be tolerated, not welcomed, and only as long as she was useful and quiet. An old family friend told me about it without meaning to over the gala gossip. How the Pembroke matriarch back then had called young Marin a project. So Marin had stood once exactly where she'd put my sister. She'd been the girl in the chair holding a contract that called her worthless. And she had a choice. The way everyone who's been hurt eventually has a choice. She could break the thing that broke her, or she could become it and decide that since she'd paid the toll, everyone after her would pay it too. She chose to become the woman who throws the paper. That's the part I can't soften. Pain explains people. It doesn't excuse them. The girl they'd called a project grew up to call my sister trash, and she did it on purpose in front of witnesses to a woman who'd done nothing but love her son. I felt one clean second of sorrow for the young Marin, and then I let it go because the older Marin had spent that sympathy herself. Every time she chose the cruelty she knew over the mercy she could have offered. She'd been given a reason to protect girls like Lily, she'd used it to hunt them instead. I keep thinking about every woman who got handed a document and a deadline and told to smile. If someone once made you sign your own smallness, I hope this next part lands for you the way it landed for us. Because the first thing I did wasn't loud. It was a bank. Marin's whole grip on my parents was $40,000 and the fear of it being called. So I took the fear off the table. I'd spent 12 years being the responsible one. And responsible, it turns out, has a balance. I had savings and I had good credit. And I had a credit union that liked engineers with steady jobs. I sat my parents down at their own kitchen table, the one I'd half grown up at, and I told them I was refinancing the loan myself, paying off the Pembrokes in full immediately, and carrying the note for the store on my own terms. Terms that read out loud. Terms my father actually read this time, line by line, with my red pen in his hand. My mother started to cry. My father didn't say much, he just gripped the pen a long time. I should have read it, he said finally. The first one. I should have read the whole thing. I told him it was all right. I told him the only thing that mattered now was that no one held a rope over our heads anymore. By Friday, the Pembroke money was gone from our family, wired back where it came from, the leverage cut clean. I didn't ask my parents to be brave. Bravery is expensive, and they were tired and frightened and human. I just took away their excuse so that when the moment came to speak, the only thing in their way would be themselves. Whitlock's letter arrived 2 days later. Heavy paper, the kind of envelope designed to make your hands shake before you open it. It was a cease and desist. It accused me of harassment, of interfering with the family, of threatening to violate a confidentiality agreement. It used a lot of Latin. A year earlier, that envelope might have worked on me, but I had Ruth now, and I sent it straight to her, and her answer was so calm it was almost funny. The confidentiality agreement they were waiving belonged to Dana Cole, and to the prenup Lily never signed. Neither one bound me. You cannot gag a stranger with someone else's contract. I'd never seen the sealed contents of anyone's case, and I never tried to. I knew only the public docket, which is the public's bylaw, and the fact of a protective order, which no settlement can reach back and ungrant. Ruth wrote Whitlock a short reply that said roughly that in the cold language that lawyers respect, and a remarkable thing happened. The threat stopped. Because here's what a cease and desist tells you when it's that aggressive over public information. It tells you they have something to hide, and they just confirmed where. You don't send a letter that frightened over nothing. Whitlock had reached for intimidation because intimidation had always worked, the family's oldest tool, and it had just slid off me and landed face up on the table, showing everyone the card. I almost felt sorry for him. He was a smart man who'd spent his career assuming no one would ever read the whole thing and call the bluff. He'd built a career on frightened people. He'd finally written to one who filed his letter under useful. The decision wasn't mine to make, and that was the hardest and best part. I'd spent 12 years carrying my sister, and the lesson of all of it came due in my apartment one evening when I laid everything out for Lily. The docket, the circled number, the protective order, Ruth's read on the prenup, and Dana's offer to stand beside her. I told her the facts, and then I shut up, which is not my gift. I told her I would back whatever she chose, including choosing nothing. She could walk away quietly, keep her peace, build a new life 2 states over the way Dana had. No one would blame her. She sat with it a long time, turning my red pen over in her hands. Then she put it down. He told me once that no one would ever believe me over him, she said. He was so sure he'd practice being sure. She looked at me. I want to stop hiding. I'm not going back to him, and I'm not apologizing for being thrown out of my own wedding. And if Dana's willing to stand next to me, then I want the truth on the record out loud where people have to hear it. I asked if she understood what that meant. That it would be public, lawful, witnessed, no secrets, and no tricks. Just 2 women telling the truth in daylight and a family record anyone could check. She said yes. For once, I wasn't carrying her. I was standing next to her the way Dana had offered to. The way maybe somebody should have stood next to a young woman called a project 40 years ago before she learned to throw the paper instead. We had 3 days until the foundation gala. Mean had built us a stage. Marin's gala was an annual thing. Black tie, the foundation's big night, the hospital wing, and the donors, and the local press who ran a photo spread every year. This year she'd repurposed it. Word had quietly gone out that the evening would include a few remarks about family, about loyalty, about not believing everything you hear. A polished rehabilitation of the Pembroke name with my sister cast as the cautionary tale. Marin had even let it be known through the right mouths that Lily would be welcome to attend, and apologized that the family was prepared to be gracious. She wanted Lily there. She wanted the public surrender. She'd built the whole night around the certainty that a shamed girl would either stay home or come crawling. So we accepted the invitation. Lily and I arrived together on time, calm, in good plain clothes that didn't try to compete with the room. Dana flew in that afternoon and met us in the parking lot. The 3 of us stood a moment under the cold lights of the Pembroke portico, that same white marble, and Dana looked up at the house and exhaled slowly. I never thought I'd come back to a place like this on purpose, she said. I had Ruth on call, the docket in a folder, the prenup behind it, and my red pen clipped to the inside cover where it always lives. I wasn't nervous, which surprised me. I felt the way I feel on a job site when the math is done and the load is rated and you finally watch them pour. Marin had built the stage and the lights and the audience. She'd done all the work. We just brought the file. The ballroom was beautiful and freezing in the way money is. Snorts, 200 people, candlelight on marble, a string quartet, the local society reporter near the front with a notebook. Marin worked the room like a captain, and when she saw the 3 of us come in, Lily, me, and a woman she didn't recognize, she made a small mistake. She smiled. She thought we'd come to surrender. Midway through the evening, she took a microphone near the head table and began her remarks. The velvet voice, the talk of family and loyalty, and how easy it is to be fooled by people who aren't what they seem. She looked right at my sister when she said it. Then she invited Lily sweetly in front of everyone to come up and say her piece, certain the piece would be an apology. I felt Lily's hand tighten on mine, and then my sister let go of my hand, which is the bravest thing I have ever watched anyone do. She walked up to the front of that cold, bright room by herself. She took the microphone Marin offered, and Marin's smile held because Marin was still sure. Lily's voice shook on the first word, and then it didn't. "You called me trash at my own wedding," she said in front of all of you. The room went quiet, the polite quiet of people who can feel a script going off the rails. Marin reached for the microphone. Lily didn't give it back. "I'm not here to apologize," Lily said. "I'm here because I stopped being afraid of your son." Across the room, Grayson set down his drink, and I stepped forward because that was the plan, the part that was mine, and I kept my voice as level as a poured floor. "Before anyone decides who to believe," I said, "I think everyone here should know what's already on the public record." I didn't raise my voice. I never do. I opened the folder on the head table, the same kind of cold marble as the entryway. I noticed the family really did love their marble, and I laid the pages down where the candlelight caught them. I want to be precise about what I did and didn't do because it's the whole point. I didn't play a recording. There wasn't one. I'd never wanted one. Secret tapes are how cowards work. I didn't read anyone's private business. I didn't know it, and hadn't tried to. I read from public documents and let the facts stand in the open air. First, the prenup. I held it up. "This is the agreement Marin Pembroke threw at my sister at the altar." I said I had a family lawyer review it, handed over hours before a wedding. No independent counsel, no financial disclosure signed under the threat of public humiliation under the law in this state that gives us strong grounds to challenge it. And a contract like that is a hard thing to enforce. It isn't a wall, it's a bluff. They never expected anyone to read the whole thing. A murmur moved through the room. Then I sat down the second page, the one that mattered. "This is a public court docket," I said. "Anyone here can pull it tomorrow. A civil case. Order granted by a judge. I'm not going to stand here and call that a conviction because it isn't one. But it's a matter of public record that a woman went to a courthouse under oath and a judge took her seriously enough to act." Justin Pembroke. The Pembroke family settled it and sealed the file. They could seal what was inside. They could not erase that it existed. And the confidentiality clause in my sister's prenup. I said the one they were so eager for her to sign references that exact settlement by number. They weren't protecting a marriage. They were extending a cover-up. I let that sit. Then I said the last thing, and I said it gently because gentle was stronger. "I can't tell you what's in the sealed file, but I'm not the only one in this room who knows what a protective order against Grayson Pembroke is for." And Dana Cole stepped out from beside my sister into the candlelight and faced a room full of the kind of people who'd paid for her silence years ago. "My name is Dana Cole," she said, steady as a level. "I am the plaintiff in that case. My settlement says I can't tell you what he did to me. It doesn't say I can't stand here and tell you it was real. I have watched concrete fail. There's a moment before it goes where the surface is still smooth and the whole thing is already lost underneath. That's what happened to the Pembroke family in that ballroom in real time in front of 200 witnesses and a reporter writing as fast as her hand would move. Grayson went pale first. The color left his face the way water leaves a tub, all at once and from the bottom. He stood up and said Dana's name like a question and then like a plea. And the room turned to look at him, and he understood too late that the warm voice wasn't going to work on a crowd that had just heard the word protective order. He started toward the doors. People moved out of his way, which is its own kind of verdict. And Marin broke. The velvet came off her all at once, and what was under it screamed. She screamed that we were liars, that the case was nothing, that Dana was a criminal who extorted her family, that I was a jealous nobody who worked with my hands. The room didn't turn on her all at once. Rooms like that never do. Some faces stayed carefully blank. The practiced neutrality of people who'd learned never to pick a side until they knew which way the money moved. A few couples gathered their coats and slipped toward the doors. Done for the night. Most just went quiet. The uneasy waiting quiet of people who hadn't decided anything yet, but had heard enough that they couldn't unhear it. Nobody applauded us. Nobody had to. The reporter kept writing, and that was the thing that would matter more than any face in that room tonight. Marin Pembroke, who had spent 40 years making sure she was never again the girl in the chair, stood in the middle of her own foundation gala and made the only scene of the entire story. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't have to. That was the inversion she never saw coming. The thing all her money couldn't price. The truth doesn't need volume. It just needs to be true. And said out loud where people have to hear it. Trash doesn't marry a Pembroke, she'd told my sister. She'd been right in the end, just backward about which was which. Snorts. The name she'd guarded her whole life was the thing on the floor now. And everyone in that beautiful cold room could see exactly what it was made of. My parents were there. I hadn't been sure they'd come. I'd told them only that they were welcome, and that I wouldn't ask them for anything. They sat near the back, and I'd half expected the old silence, the carefully blank faces, the laps studied like scripture. But the loan was gone now. The rope was cut. And in the quiet, after Marin's screaming wound down, my father stood up. Dale Callaway, who hadn't said a full sentence about any of this in months, stood up in a borrowed suit in a room full of rich strangers, and said in a voice that carried further than he meant it to, "That's my daughter you called trash. Both of them are mine, and I'm done being quiet about it." It wasn't much. It was everything. My mother took his hand. The silence that had been bought and held for months broke right there, and the only people left making noise in that ballroom were the Pembrokes. The foundation's board chair crossed the room toward Marin, not to defend her, but to get her out of the lights before anyone filmed more of it. That night, mostly there was just stunned quiet and a thinning crowd. The real consequences came later, the way they actually come, slow and on paper. The reporter's story ran that week, careful and sourced to public records. And once it was in print, the questions started arriving in places money couldn't reach. An inquiry from the foundation's board, 2 corporate sponsors quietly declining to renew while they reviewed the matter. A venue that suddenly had a scheduling conflict. None of it happened in that ballroom. It happened over the weeks after, once the thing was in daylight and couldn't be sealed. Donors don't like protective orders. Boards don't like reporters. Nobody throws a contract at a bride twice. I gathered my folder off the marble, capped my red pen, and found my sister in the crowd. She wasn't crying, she was standing very straight, the way you stand when you finally set down something you've carried too long. "You okay?" I asked. "No," she said and almost smiled. "But I will be." We walked out together across that cold marble portico for the second time, Lily and Dana and me, into a night that felt about 10 degrees warmer outside than in. The fountain was still running. It always ran, even when no one was watching, because that's what the Pembrokes paid for. The appearance of a thing instead of the thing. Dana hugged my sister in the parking lot. 2 women who'd been told the same lie by the same man and decided years apart not to keep it. "Thank you for standing next to me," Lily said. "You stood next to me first," Dana said. "I just heard about it 2 states away." I thought about the prenup torn in half on the grass at a wedding, and the docket sheet with 1 red circle around a number money couldn't erase. Paper tears. So does a story that was never true. Once enough people are willing to say so out loud. I drove my sister home to my small, warm apartment that smelled like eucalyptus. And for the first time in over a year, when her phone lit up on the seat between us, she didn't flip it over. She just let it glow. The fallout ran slow and public, the way real consequences do. The foundation's board asked Grayson to step down from his role within the month. Institutions can survive a sealed case, but not a documented one. Not with a reporter's photo of the night it cracked. Other filings began to surface in the daylight where Dana and Ruth could see them. Not sealed secrets, just the ordinary records that pile up around a man who's been quietly handled before. Each one a little easier to find once people knew to look. Marin stopped being invited to the things she'd built her life around. The prenup, of course, went nowhere. There was nothing to enforce and no one left who wanted to try. My parents are slowly becoming themselves again, lighter, the way people get when a debt and a fear leave the house at the same time. Dad reads things now, the whole thing with a pen, and Lily left. She rebuilt in Des Moines first, a tiny studio and a kiln and a part-time class. And then last spring, she moved to Portland and opened a little ceramic shop with a name over the door that's hers and no one else's. She sells bowls, charming little bowls, the kind a 60-year-old woman once said with a curl of her lip. People love them. She sends me one every birthday. I keep them on the windowsill where the light's good, where nothing is cold marble and nothing is for show. A name can't make you clean and it can't make you trash. Only what you do in the daylight can. So when the truth is yours to tell, tell it in the daylight out loud where the people who tried to bury it have to stand there and hear it. That's my story. One torn page, one public record, one sister who finally stopped hiding, and one father who finally stood up. If this reminded you that silence is a choice and so is the truth, make the braver choice today before someone hands you a deadline shaped like an altar. And if you know a woman who needs to hear it, send her this. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.